Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Welcome back, and thank you for inviting me into your home this week. We are talking, and by we, as you can see here, I am joined this week by John P. Capitalist. Hi, John.
Howdy.
Hey. Welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I've been off doing other things. Still follow Scientology, but and cults and extremist behavior, but haven't been as active lately. But I wanted to reach out and knock around a couple of ideas for podcasts with you.
Exactly, and they were great ideas. They were going to do this one, and then we have at least one more planned as well, which I think you guys are going to like. So this week we are discussing, Scientology again, and lately, as you guys have seen from interviews I've been doing, and other information that's been coming in, there has been quite a bit of trouble in the Scientology universe over the last couple of years. And if you have, and I'm not even going to try to reiterate everything that has been covered by hours of podcasting. There's a lot of details, and we're going to cover a lot of those through the course of this talk. But let's just leave it at Scientology's in a lot of trouble right now. But how much trouble, and how much long-term trouble? And the reason I'm so happy to have John on today is because he is playing a little bit of a devil's advocate role for me, both privately when we were doing prep for this, and here publicly. I wanted to sort of, I have an optimism bias, I will say. That's a thing, right? Where you kind of get a little bit too optimistic about the possibilities of what could happen. And with Scientology, of course, for years and years, lots and lots of people over the course of time have thought this legal case, this screw up, this mess up, this government intervention of some kind is going to spell the end of Scientology. It's going to be all over. We're not going to hear about him anymore. A year or two from now, it's going to, be dust, right? And those predictions have uniformly been wrong. Scientology is still around. And so with the recent troubles, I got to thinking with my optimism bias, hey, wow, maybe this, I don't know, this is looking pretty bad. And so in talking with John about it, he was like, well, there's a few things to consider. And I thought, what a great show. Let's do this as a show so I can share this with you guys and what some of his thoughts on this were. So did that about cover it, John?
Absolutely. I think that's a good statement.
Excellent. So what we're going to do is basically look at kind of point by point what's been happening and what we can and can't derive from that. What should we be thinking about this? Mm-hmm. And in a conservative manner rather than an overly optimistic one.
Right. So what I'd like to do is start off before we look at specific things that are happening in Scientology. I'd like to to talk about some general thoughts about how you predict things. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of drawn from all my experience in all these years at Global Capitalism Headquarters, where we're trying to predict the future of companies and thus their stock prices. And also some other work, around, the political environment or geopolitics or, global finance and all sorts of other things that have bearing on the market. And I have also, I tend to be an optimist like you about, bad people, bad things happening to bad people, good things happening to good people. And I tend to overstate how fast and how significant those events can be. So what I want to do is I want to say, look, I am absolutely on the side of believing as hard as anybody else in the home viewing audience that Scientology is a dangerous organization and that it would be better for the world if Scientology didn't have any impact on the world. So I am on everybody's side here. But what I wanted to do was to talk about how to be more thoughtful about the impact of some of these problems and challenges on Scientology so that we're more able to continue to campaign to expose its abuses and reduce its ability to inflict harm on people. You're right. In other words, I'm trying to remind people this is a marathon and not a sprint.
Exactly. Great. So, so what about doomsday apocalypse?
Okay. Yeah. So let's, so you could certainly say, there are some doomsday things that are bouncing, or there are some very significant things that are bouncing around. All right. You do have, we will talk about some variety of all the following and maybe more. We'll talk about COVID, and we'll talk about the Chase wave. We'll talk probably briefly. I don't think it's that important to the overall discussion here. The Danny Masterson case. We'll talk about the potential for arbitration agreements to be invalidated, which I think opens a major litigation front. And there's probably other stuff that I'm not thinking of at the moment.
Those are the main things on the menu right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that, predicting doom for organizations is really perilous. And, it's like predicting the end of the world. It's really just a sort of a sub variety of the genre of apocalyptic predictions. And you have to realize also that Scientology is actually a very complex organization. It's a relatively small size, but there's about 5,000 staff members serving maybe on the order of 15,000 members. So there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of bureaucratic momentum that can carry Scientology along without a strong leader. So even in the case of a leadership vacuum, such as Miscavige dying or having a health problem that means that he can't run the organization, it can continue for quite a while. And so I think that organizational complexity is actually a very important indicator of survival ability. The NXIVM sex cult in Albany, New York, where the leader was recently sentenced to life in prison, they had a few thousand active members, a couple, 2,000 to 3,000, not much smaller than Scientology, but they only had about 10 paid staff members. So when the founder was arrested, the organization was just simply not able to continue. It couldn't make payroll, couldn't keep the offices open, and it basically rolled up the sidewalks within a couple of months after Keith Raniere was arrested. So organizational complexity is something that we, that gives a lot of momentum to a company, even one that's facing disastrous situations. And then, the thing that made the other point, as you hinted, is there have been massive shocks that have hurt Scientology before. Operation Snow White, where most of the senior management team went to jail. Hubbard was an unindicted conspirator, but his wife went to jail, and 11 or 13 other people. You would think that would absolutely cause any organization to blow up, and yet Scientology's membership peaked a decade after Operation Snow White.
Yep.
Scientology also survived the death of Hubbard, and there was clearly no succession plan in place. Pat and Annie Broker were just not the people that were going to be capable of running that organization, and nobody saw Miscavige coming. The Debbie Cook email, Leah Remini's show, plus all the other books, documentaries, and all that stuff. The Tom Cruise couch jumping video.
Anonymous protests that went on for a year.
Yep. And the internet, all of this stuff, they've continued to survive.
Yep.
And so the thing is that the current problems are absolutely serious, but Scientology will adapt. So we can talk a little bit about what I think in terms of adaptations that it can do. And I think if we have time, we can also talk about that there are potentially some things that could hurt Scientology more waiting in the wings, that could cause the wheels not to come off, but that could further impair the company's or the organization's ability to cause damage.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
So that's kind of the 5-minute overview. And then if we say, okay, let's dive into the theory. So let's talk about apocalyptic predictions. Apocalyptic predictions, predicting the end of the world in particular, have actually been going on for about 2,000 years. And interestingly, apocalypse doesn't mean end of the world inherently. It initially meant secret wisdom, right? So that, a lot of times when people are predicting the end of the world, they're essentially claiming that they have secret wisdom and that they have this unique vision and unique credibility.
How interesting that ties directly in with Lifton's thought reform points, the secret knowledge or sacred science.
Yeah. And so, I think people either make these predictions or they want to believe them because they want to feel special,
Mhm.
right? If you are a peasant in medieval England, or if you are a person in a small town in America that never goes anywhere and doesn't see much of the world and isn't very educated and feels like life is passing them by, the idea that, you know, I'm not just another peasant um, living a peasant life that will ultimately be forgotten. If the end of the world comes when I'm alive, that's going to be really cool, especially if the apocalypse is the harbinger of a better world to come.
Yes. And that's
Okay.
actually one of the fears, even outside Scientology, with Christian nationalism or some of these more extreme versions of apocalyptic thinking in
Yeah.
America right now.
Yeah. And if you think about it, not just the extremists, but this has been a factor for a while. The Jehovah's Witnesses in 1918,
Mhm.
right? That's a whole, they are one of many religions coming out of a tradition called the Millerites. Um, and there were other groups as well that believed, the end of the world was going to happen in our lifetimes. So the JWs went out big and bet on 1918 as being the end of the world. And to a certain extent, you can understand that because what was going on in 1918 was World War One,
That's right.
and it sure looked like the end of the world was at hand. If you looked at the smoldering rubble that Europe was left in, and the senseless slaughter, and the just the idiocy of why the war got started, all of that, it sure looked like the world was toast.
Yeah.
And the JWs have been trying to figure out how to get past the 1918 prediction and all of the other failed end of the world predictions since. And I think it's finally starting to dawn on people that maybe the end of the world is just not going to happen in our lifetime. Um, and on a smaller scale, sort of going from the big, hey, the end of the universe down to something a little more practical. Um, let's look at another example, the Soviet Union. So everybody in the West that was a political scientist or political strategist or economist or whatever, everybody in the West knew that the Soviet Union was unsustainable. The business model simply didn't work. They were spending half of their GDP on defense. They couldn't feed their people. They were importing grain from the West that they denounced. Um, and it was an utter, complete train wreck. So the thing was, everybody did know that the Soviet Union was doomed, but absolutely nobody correctly predicted when it would fall apart and what would and what would be the collapse that brought it down. And it
And
was
that actually, I just want to kind of underline and boldface that for a second because having lived through that, as well, I thought that was such a good point. Just because everybody's predicted the end of Scientology, right? But when it finally happens, it'll probably be through some fashion that nobody sees coming.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so I think another example. So if we sort of take it down from countries to cults, um, again, returning to NXIVM, and on my blog a few years ago, I did a comparison when Raniere was arrested in 2018 between Scientology and NXIVM, and my thesis was that it wasn't actually a horribly similar situation, but there were some. It was more of a fun article than a detailed blow by blow. But the thing was, NXIVM was never a tenth as big as Scientology.
No.
But they poked along for 20 years until and they had a spy wing that was like OSA. They sued opponents ruthlessly,
Mhm.
and so they did a lot of the sort of stuff to fight with enemies that Scientology did. But the thing that blew them up was this small group within the larger organization where um, where they were branding women with Keith Raniere's initials without their consent. And then when the New York Times picked up a story that was written by a blogger that had disclosed this, um, the government went after him and shut him down. Um, and so the thing was, yes, NXIVM imploded quickly, but it took a lot longer than anybody had thought. And so a lot of parallels there with Scientology, a lot of people pointing out, financial irregularities, all sorts of other bad behavior. You can read up on NXIVM, but the thing is that a smaller cult than Scientology was harder to kill.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you say, okay, So we have this horrible track record as humans, and even as educated expert humans, like all the political scientists on the Soviet Union. Um, we have this horrible track record in predicting organizational collapse. So you say, okay, why are we so bad at this? And the answer is that most analysis does what's called straight lining the present. So you take the present instant and you say that's the way it's going to be forever. So the present instant of what Scientology is dealing with in the wake of COVID, chase wave, blah blah blah, and say that's going to be their reality forever. And we tend to underestimate counter moves, the degree of energy that an organization will put in. You start to get the idea that it's like a wounded deer, that you have, is just going to sit there and lick its wounds until you finish it off, from deer hunting, and that's really naive. Organizations really stop. Rarely they don't stop. They go deer in the headlights and they freeze and wait for the car to hit it. And so I think we have to look for both structural situations that show significant weakness, and I think we misassess those. And we'll talk about some of the things we misassess with Scientology, and then there has to be a catalyst.
Actually, great points. And let me perhaps throw a couple examples out here that have just come to light from the interviews I've been doing lately, where we have more present time information coming out of the organization now, and we find out things like, yes, it's absolutely positively confirmed that the RPF is no more. There's no more RPF. It was completely canceled. There were other changes made. The forced abortions issue it's still present, but not to the degree and not anywhere near as blatant as it used to be.
Right.
The enforced disconnection is very much still in play, but the willingness, the enthusiasm that the organization of Scientology has now for openly declaring suppressive its own members, right, Sea Org members and Scientologists, has gone way, way down.
Let me just ask about that. Are you saying, because we've known for a long time that they no longer publish the official Goldenrod SP declares, and we know that there's a particular way that on Facebook they encourage you to unfriend people so that it doesn't look like the organization is the one that's doing it.
Yep.
Are you talking about something that's in addition to those kinds of things?
I am. It's a change of practice where it's an attempt to minimize the disconnection. And the way they figured out to do this, and they actually did this to me, and then they ended up kicking me out anyway. But in order to try to minimize it, what they do is they sit the person down and say, well, look, you've committed violations of our justice codes, of our high crimes. In other words, you've done things that are suppressive acts. That's what we call it in Scientology. Because you've done those things and you acknowledge you've done those things, we're not going to declare you, but you're still going to have to do the A to E steps, or you're still going to have to jump through these various hoops we're going to give you in order to get back in good standing and good graces. But we're not kicking you out. We're not disconnecting you. We're not even kicking you out of the Sea Org in some cases. We're just going to make you do this penance internally here, and we're going to kind of treat you like you're a suppressive, but not really. And they apparently are concentrating that kind of attention on people who have family or connections where if they were severed or disconnected, it could end up in a PR problem, as it has for years. I mean, you go to Tony's blog to this day, he's got a running total of, Sally Sue has been disconnected from her daughters for 3,000 days. And he's got a long list of people, and they're trying to not add any more names to that list.
Right.
So the point being that these have been responses to what we have all been, Leah, Tony, Mike, me to a lesser degree, have been exposing for years now. Scientology's actually changed. And believe me, 10 years ago, I never would have imagined that they would ever cancel the RPF. So
So
just building on what you just said there.
yeah, so now let's look at that from an economic standpoint. So, certainly from a standpoint of, that this is a PR move, that's, likely. But I think it's also very important on an economic move. Now, before I get into that, let's remember that this is policy. This has been a long time part of the organization. And so in order to risk the chaos and the questioning and the doubt and so forth when something big change like this is made, you have to say, well, what's worse? What is the worst? What is the thing that's worse than having to tell people, having to sell people who might say this is off policy? What's worse than eliminating the RPF and taking heat for that? And the answer is, I think there's probably a worker shortage. Even with all the stuff that they're doing with the R1 visas and all the other stuff that they're doing to dragoon people into the Sea Org or into being on staff. So how many people, when you were like on RPF, would you say were on RPF at any given time across the organization?
Across the world, it was going to be somewhere between 200 or 300 people.
Okay, that's about what I thought.
Yeah.
And so you think all of a sudden those 300 people, can't be put into just shit work. You need them for customer facing or administrative tasks, and you can't put them into made up punitive work, which is essentially, cleaning toilets with a toothbrush. It doesn't actually forward the organization.
Right.
It may result in clean bathrooms, but that doesn't actually drive the organization's mission successfully. Right. So it sounds to me like there's a labor shortage, and there's also behind the lack of disconnection. That works on rank and file people. But if let's pretend that Bobby Dugan's one of Bobby Dugan's kids is in the Sea Org, and is suppressive and now has to disconnect from dad or something, and dad decides he doesn't like to do that. You got a billionaire against Scientology and who can draw, the way if you try to disconnect a whale's kid from them, it could really blow up in a big way.
Yep.
Whereas if you disconnect, if some chiropractor's kid disconnects from them to stay in the Sea Org, probably not such a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
And there's also the secondary layer of PR in that what has all the exposure from Leah and Mike, Going Clear, et cetera, done for prominent whales who are known to be Scientologists, right? For their social networks and their professional connections as well. It's like, ooh, you're a Scientologist. Whoa,
Yeah, no, I do think that there's some exposure there, but that's not something I really think I have enough, perspective to discuss meaningfully.
Fair enough. Just throwing it out there as an idea.
Sure. Okay, so let's go back and let's talk about what causes organizations to collapse. Mm-hmm. And it's usually multiple issues at a time, multiple structural issues: people, money, available cash, competition, legal. It's not just one thing that causes an organization to really become fatally wounded. And the more complex it is, the more issues can be off, and the longer it can go before it sinks. And so, I think we talked about this. I think you talked about this in a couple of podcasts ago, and I'll go to it again. The cult that lived forever was called the Muggletonians.
Yes.
And this actually started in 1650. You said it was 18 something, but it's actually 1650. Yeah. And the last Muggletonian died in 1979. So they lasted for over 300 years. And yet they never had more than maybe 1,000 people at their peak. And they were never really a force in the world, that was all that significant. And yet there they were. Another one is the Shakers. The Shakers, is not they're a small religious sect. And at one point there were several thousand of them around the country, right? We know them for Shaker furniture and, these this lovely design of the artifacts that they built. But there's a handful of Shakers today after the group was founded 250, almost 300 years ago. There's still 3 or 4 left in Maine today, and they survived despite the fact that celibacy was an essential requirement. So that was, you talk about an impediment to recruiting.
Right. They can't have kids.
Yeah, no kids to join the Sea Org or the Shaker
Right. No
Org or
second
whatever it is.
sins.
Right. And so these organizations have lasted for a very long time.
Yep.
And so, you know,
Actually, if I can contribute,
sure.
it's flat Earth.
Uh-huh.
I'll throw that out there as an example of something you'd think would. I mean, it almost died off. It started the Flat Earth Society. I mean, that goes back to the 1800s.
Right.
Trace the history of this, right? It's a couple people. They build up this community. They build up this mailing list of a couple thousand people at its peak, and
Yep.
it looked like it was dead in the 70s, and it got resuscitated. And it built back up under a whole new management, kind of a whole different set of people took it
Yep.
over, and it got a whole new life. And a couple of years ago, not that many years ago, people were all over my plate freaking out about flat Earth taking over the world, and I was like, okay, calm down, guys. It's not really that many people, but these things can grow again, and try to kill flat Earth. It just won't. It's an idea that just won't ever die.
Yep. No, it's that's true.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at another sort of factor that we want to think about in predicting organizational collapse, and one that I think has been pretty tempting to whether you know it by the proper name or not over the last couple of years, looking at Scientology's challenges, and that's what we call an exogenous shock versus an endogenous shock. So an exogenous shock is something that comes upon an organization, that happens to an organization that's completely unable to you can't predict, and that you can't control. And these are the hardest things to deal with. And so we look at Scientology and then say, that they have had a couple of exogenous shocks. And so here's how I would differ, or here's how I would sort of define this a little bit further. So an airline has, airlines go and fly airplanes, and every so often one crashes. But a crash is not an exogenous shock, even if it comes from an outside circumstance, because it's bounded. The resolution of the problem is bounded and well understood. Airlines and the aircraft manufacturers and the subsystem manufacturers all have go teams, and they operate out of very well-defined playbooks of what to do when a crash occurs. And so, a crash is a big mess. It's a tragedy for those who lose their lives or are injured. It's a big economic loss, but it's something that's well bounded and people know how to deal with. And so
it's not an unpredicted for, and nobody knows what to do with this kind of a situation.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, to continue with the airline metaphor, COVID was absolutely an exogenous shock for an airline. So even though the airlines had been thinking about what happens if a global pandemic gets loose, what happens to our business, they had been thinking about that a little bit from the SARS thing back, whatever that was, 6 or 8, however many years ago, which was well contained, and also from some Ebola, limited release of Ebola outside its traditional, fields in West Africa and stuff like that. So they'd been thinking about it, but they didn't really have a playbook that would really encompass what happened with COVID. But they survived.
Yeah, I don't think anybody had a playbook for COVID. Man,
not even close. And a number of people have been warning for years that if something got loose, it was going to be about this bad. But the playbooks that existed, the Trump administration completely ignored a playbook that Obama had tried to put together. They just like threw it out and like, who needs this junk? And then sure enough, they did.
And that's almost literally what happened. I mean, They literally had binders of knowledge of here's what to do, here's how we're going to deal with this, and they literally just threw it all out.
Yep, they didn't show up for the meeting.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so Scientology has had a lot of endogenous shocks, internally caused things like Operation Snow White, supporting Danny Masterson, all kind, an endless list of those. The Debbie Cook email was kind of half and half. They couldn't control her sending out that email. She was largely out of Scientology. She was out of the Sea Org and was largely out of Scientology when she did it. They could control their reaction to it, and of course, they screwed it up every possible way that you can imagine. But the thing is, with an exogenous shock, the key thing is you can't rely on a playbook. Playbook can help you, but resilience is key, and that's being able to change and adapt. You can't blindly follow a playbook. You can't, you have to wing it, and that's absolutely what Scientology is unable to do as an organization, and what cults are in general unable to do because they're selling certainty. They've already got the answer,
That's right.
and
I'll tell you. Let me throw another thing out here specifically that occurred to me with Scientology in relation to this entire concept. Is Hubbard wrote a number of policies, a number of issues that make it crystal clear that Scientology will never be hurt by exogenous shocks. It is always only the internally created problems that will stop Scientology. It is never the world outside. And we just do what we're supposed to do and we will magically grow and succeed is basically the dogma.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it that way. So in other words, that you don't have to pay attention to this stuff. And I think that's always that particular assumption is always, cultic, right? That if the organization grows, it's because Scientology is perfect. If the organization doesn't grow, it's because the employees are screwing up.
That's right.
So exogenous shocks would be quickly translated into you're screwing up.
Exactly. That's exactly where, and that's where they go 100% of the time.
Yep.
Yep.
So let's see. I want to think about. By the way, it's an interesting question, and I don't know that we should discuss it here or we should even answer it, but it'd be fun to think about. Was COVID a bigger exogenous shock for Scientology than the internet? Um, and I think there's two parts to the internet. One is the anonymous protests that were generated by early social media.
Yeah.
And when all of a sudden you had more anons showing up globally outside Scientology facilities protesting than you had Scientologists, all of a sudden, the freak out is due to the fact that Scientology can no longer scale to meet the outside world. That I think had to have been the biggest issue. Scientology formerly had, because they had a lot of money, they could hire more PIs to hassle one person. So when it's one person versus the organization, Scientology had the advantage of scale. But all of a sudden, you had somebody you had a group of people, of average humans with no money that could raise 30, 40, 50,000 protesters.
That's right.
All of a sudden,
Scientology was wholly unprepared for that.
yeah. And it was the underlying reality of that all of a sudden we don't have the advantage of scale. The world has changed, that I think has probably caused, a paranoia that I don't think Scientology has really sorted through.
Nope. I agree.
And I think the other thing, in the style of the Anons, that people are laughing at Scientology instead of afraid of it, I think was another legacy. But then, of course, you have the ongoing impact, which I think ultimately is far greater. Gosh, was it really 14 years ago that the Anon protests happened?
Yeah, 2008.
Wow. And you have, mobile devices where it's like, I see Scientology, I see somebody body routing outside of a Scientology org, and I just say, Siri, what is Scientology? And 30 seconds later, I'm hightailing it out of there.
That's right.
Right. So that's the long-term issue. So
It's
then
a very interesting question. I actually would encourage anybody in the comments to contribute to that, because I don't have a pat answer either. The internet versus COVID. These were both devastating events for Scientology.
Yeah. So let's talk later about COVID, but I wanted to talk, sort of finish up the discussion of theoretical stuff with one other point.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something I've been doing a lot with geopolitical analysis and economic stuff at, work lately. And there's most people tend to ignore the role of demographics in human affairs. And demographics move very, very slowly, but very powerfully. Changes in population trends, whether that's birth rates, migration, et cetera. And the people that do demographics say demography is destiny. And and so there's a lot of people that watch this for predictive power. And so, I think there's a lot of interest on the fact that the Chinese population is going to be declining much faster than anybody expected based on recent census data that came out not that long, a few months ago. Um, but I think that, and I think that ultimately, yes, that will mean the end of China as a rising global power if their population drops by half in the next 40 years, which looks likely. But on the way
Wow.
down, a lot,
Yeah,
but a lot can happen between now and then.
that's right.
So it's we look at Scientology and we look at the fact that so much of their population is aging out. The hardcore members, the whales, the hardcore members, and so forth. And we look at the overall membership population is declining, and certainly COVID's had an impact there. And we can predict the end of the organization. And I think if you look at solely demographics and you don't look at the battlefield scenario of what Scientology is going to do to battle the demographic decline, which they have to be aware of in some degree. Whether Miscavige likes to think about it or not, he's aware that the numbers are going nowhere but down.
Absolutely. He definitely, on a weekly basis, he knows exactly where they're at.
Yeah, and so even if the money is still there, the body counts are going down, and so the demographics are definitely unfavorable for Scientology, but when you look at the degree to which they are unfavorable, that doesn't give you the power to say that the end is closer.
That's right.
And so
Right.
that's a field as I wanted to mention just because I've been doing a lot of work on it myself, and just really just saying that's an area where I think people are overestimating decline based solely on demographic criteria.
Okay, got it. Yeah, because like a point to bring up with this is like we mentioned with the Shakers, I think you said earlier, right?
Yep.
Where they're not having kids, right? It's celibacy. Well, the Sea Org is the same way. You
Yeah,
can't have kids in the Sea Org, right? So you can get people in, but they're not gonna grow through reproduction. But the
that's it.
public level Scientologists and the staff can still have kids, but not the Sea Org.
Yeah.
You know,
Although the decline of staff in the orgs and sending in Sea Org to run some of the outer orgs, certainly is that's that's choking off even the limited ability of the staff to reproduce.
that's true. That's very true.
So
And it says something. The fact that they're even doing that now says an awful lot about how much they've had to pull in their flippers a little bit to cover these areas that they just don't have the personnel for to deal with otherwise. Because
yep,
they're only going to be able to pull that stunt so many times because there's only so many Sea Org members.
yep, exactly right.
Yeah.
So okay, so let's think about Scientology. So we've been talking mostly about theoretical kind of issues about the over optimism that we have of predicting the timing or the causes of collapse of organizations. We talk about some of the errors that people make when they think about that. So I think this is time to move on to just say let's talk about Scientology and let's talk about COVID. Um, so you've got a lot more data points from the people that you're in much more frequent touch with than I am about what's been going on. But
Mhm.
I think at the top level, right, what was certainly entirely predictable as the stories of the steps that the orgs were taking started to leak out is that COVID rapidly came into conflict with what cults do, right? Cults sell certainty. And so, and often that certainty is that the dogma, whatever garbage dogma that they come up with, they're selling certainty that it's right.
Mhm.
And, usually the dogma is wrong, but that's a longer talk for a different day. And so, Scientology saw the opportunity, as I'm sure other people did, of saying, we've got the solution. And people would be expecting them to have the answer based on their um, based on their, this is why people come to Scientology.
Mhm.
But the thing is that COVID, there was a lot of wrong science about COVID early on. That it was transmitted on surfaces. That went away almost immediately when people realized that it was purely respiratory, person to person transmission. It doesn't live very long, on banisters and door handles and toilet seats. But Scientology went out hard and fast and painted itself in a corner. And then the thing was that they couldn't say also, because they know that their population is going to be typically very anti-vax, very anti, standard medicine, that they had to have the Decon 7, which is that toxic cleaning solution. But we've also, I think, forgotten to mention, lately, they are also out there with ozone generators, I think it was,
Mm.
and, which are quack remedies that, ozone does kill germs. They do, and they kill viruses very effectively. The problem was that they were having these, tabletop ozone generators. And if you look at the amount of output, um, was woefully insufficient to actually have any meaningful impact on viruses, even if they were living on surfaces.
Right.
So there was a whole bunch of other quack stuff that they got stapled to. And then you have Miscavige amping up the verbiage with the planetary bobate nonsense. Um, you know, us versus them. Look at how special and smart we are.
That's right.
And so now he can't, as long as COVID is in the world, he can't change. He can't dial down the rhetoric, and he looks more and more out of touch. So,
Right.
you know,
Actually, something that occurs to me right now is that line, right, that he wrote in this issue, the whole COVID thing is planetary bulbate. Up, planetary bulbate. It's at it again. That's exactly the attitude that is demonstrated over and over again about these exogenous shocks. Is up, whatever. They just write it off. It's just And had COVID only lasted a month or two, they would have weathered that just fine.
yep,
And they've
yep,
been proven right that it was just we could ignore this, no big deal. But that kind of thing, that kind of bad policy, you get away with it until you can't, until you don't, right?
yep,
And you're just lucking out is really what you're doing. You're just whistling past the graveyard, and that's what Scientology's been doing from day
yep,
one.
yeah. And so like, you know, um, my employer and a lot of others said, I look back at the emails we got from management, from upper management about COVID in the early days. It's like, okay, we're all going to be working at home for a couple of weeks, and we'll probably, when this wave is passed, we'll be opening up the offices. Um, it's like it was laughably naive. On the other hand, it was all in a culture of we're going to go out and we're going to get the best advice we can. We're not going to try to figure this out ourselves because we're not epidemiologists.
Right.
We're a company that makes money, and we're going to use the best resources we have. And we're probably, the management's message was from day one, our response to this is likely to change, and we don't know where it's going to go. And so we all have to stay resilient and flexible and just roll with it as best we can,
Yep. Exactly.
as opposed to the certainty of we got this figured out. And at that point, Miscavige has handcuffed himself to the deck rail of the Titanic.
Exactly. And that's what happened. To this day, it's still happening.
Yeah. And so, I think wasn't there something that in one of your podcasts, Catherine said recently that they're wearing the metal off of the plating off of the doorknobs by decontaminating them. And they have what did she say about the amount of effort in an org, how many people, what percentage of the staff were doing nothing but decontaminating things?
Oh yeah, it was like 3 or 4 staff full time in these organizations, and these are organizations that have maybe 30 or 40 staff. So you got like 10% of them just fogging rooms that nobody's walking in
Yeah.
4 or 5 times a day, and they spend millions of dollars on these buildings, refinished wood, beautiful metal plating, and it's all going to rot because the industrial strength cleaner that they're overusing is literally eating into the material.
Yeah. And, what's interesting, by the way, is let's look at another example where you have a cult-like problem with COVID, and that is the People's Republic of China. As we're talking, they have this zero COVID policy to prove that the Chinese political system is superior, as opposed to allowing 1 million people to die in the U.S., which is a horrific thing, and I'm not in favor of it. Don't want to sound like I'm in favor of it in making this argument, but China said, well, we're superior to the decadent and declining West. We're going to make sure that nobody dies of COVID in China. Now, of course, one important part of that is lying about the statistics, but we won't go into that. What they're doing is they're locking down anytime anybody tests positive for COVID, they lock down their neighborhood. And so all of the big cities of China are undergoing various lockdowns. And as soon as they get it under control, they bring it back, or somebody gets it and then they go back into lockdown. And it's going to cause a massive decline in GDP, particularly exports. It's going to cause major financial woes. And the population is pissed because when you lock down Shanghai, that's a huge center of the economy. It's a lot of well-off middle class and upper middle class professionals, and they're being treated like animals. They're not getting food. And why are they doing that? It's because the government can't admit that the Chinese developed vaccines don't work.
Right.
They can't go out and buy mRNA vaccines to the West, from the West, to just go ahead and just go ahead and give everybody
like saving face is more important to them than the actual safety and security of their people.
Yeah, and proving that the government has their backs, and I think enough people. There are plenty of people out there in China that know the score. But the thing is that President Xi has created this cult of personality that he can do no wrong, that he's the smartest guy ever, kind of the L. Ron Hubbard of governments, and he's got to show this strong leadership, and he's taken the country off a cliff, right? That they're going to have a GDP decline for the first time in 40 years, and a lot of people are pissed. And the problem from the standpoint of the West is, if we can't count on their production of stuff that we want to buy from them, we're going to Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia or all sorts of other countries that want to handle our business.
Right.
And
right. So we're seeing what could be a real shift in power dynamics on the global stage because of this whole situation.
Yeah, and this cult-like certainty that they can handle COVID, a certainty that's laughable to those of us who believe in science.
Right. That's
so,
right. So where you see Scientology as the microcosm, you see China as like this more macro picture of this.
Exactly. So here's the thing, right? I think this is your cue to talk about what people have been telling you in terms of numbers, that a huge percentage of the public are not coming into orgs for services, and may not. Please correct me. I thought it was you were saying something like a third of the public are like out of touch now.
Yeah, that's what we're hearing. Between Catherine, the insider, and other sources I have, they're all kind of corroborating one another right now. And this is just the best data I've got. Mm-hmm. I don't have Scientology demographics, right? But what the observation we have is that upwards of a third of the membership is outright refusing to come back into the churches right now, into the orgs. And that's kind of across the boards. Between mandated quarantine times and the masks and having to wear gloves and the Decon 7 and all these other nonsensical policies they've put in place. I don't think Miscavige personally is aware of just how conspiracy-minded his Scientologist group is. I just don't think he's really got a clue, because his moves smacked right into it. And that's where the outrage is coming from with this third of the population of Scientology right now, is they're just like, what are you talking about? I have to wear masks and gloves. COVID's not even a real thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all fake news. What are you talking about?
Yeah, why are you vaccinating the Sea Org?
Right. They couldn't even tell. They couldn't even let the public know they were vaccinated, because it started coming up that this was a thing, and they were like, "Oh yeah, okay, we can't talk about this." And this is not, this part of the problem is not even the exogenetic I mean, this is internally created. This conspiracy mindset has been used for decades in Scientology to make all kinds of money.
Mhm.
So now it's biting them in the butt.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh, you could just sort of sit back and smile
Oh,
and
it's such karmic justice. I
yeah,
have to laugh.
yeah.
Yeah.
So now, so I think, by the way, one important thing to take away from that is we may be seeing a third of the population or a third of the public refusing to come in at the moment.
Mhm.
But I would caution against saying that that's the same as a third of the people have blown. Um,
Me too. Me too. That is something I've been wondering about, is how much work is it going to take to get those people back, and how many of them are permanently gone? Impossible to say right now.
Yeah. Now, I mean, they've got to get out of COVID mode and take off the gloves and stop the Decon 7.
Right.
Yeah, there's things about, hey, hey, the quarantine on the free wins is down to 5 days, and it's free now and all that. So they're trying to signal that, but I don't think they're we won't know for another year or two. I don't think.
No, and it'll be interesting to see. I am personally curious as to, since I have been broadcasting this with a bullhorn for the last month now on my channel, and I think I'm pretty much the only source of knowledge on this stuff, in terms of a public venue, because Leah's podcast isn't going right now. They're between seasons, and there isn't really any other major site except Tony's blog, of course, which is also talking about this. Um, I'm wondering, how long until Scientology calls it quits with a great big bullhorn, is like, no more COVID restrictions. It's all canceled. It's all good. Everybody come back in. I'm predicting that this is going to happen sooner than later at this point,
Mhm.
given how much we've been talking about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I don't know if they're going to be able to just say, "Hey, we're totally open," um, because there's still an element of, we were wrong.
Yes,
Um,
that's right.
but I think uh, I think you're right that they are going to pull the trigger and they'll figure out something.
Yeah.
Um,
They're just figuring out the spin right now, probably, is where it's
yeah,
at.
yeah. So I think the question is, okay, so what are the impact of COVID in terms of member counts? And the answer is, yeah, a lot of people aren't coming in. Don't know how many of those are blowing. But the second is, what is the impact on the finances? And I've done work in the past about, how much money do they typically pull in a year? And the best number that I've been able to come up with is somewhere between 200 million to 300 million. And 300 is maybe a little bit on the high side. Maybe a third of that is IAS, maybe a third of that is flag, and maybe a third of that is everything else.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
COVID could
Well,
have,
apparently, and now, and under that umbrella of everything else, by the way, is we have the whole ideal org, give us money to renovate the buildings thing, and that's been the scam for the last 20 years.
yeah, I've sort of tended to think of that as IAS as opposed to, sort of program based revenue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, the ideal, well, I'll differentiate those two things, because
Okay.
the priority in a given area is, ideal org money, right? Get the money to renovate the church, the building. Once that's done now, then the IAS comes swooping in with, membership money. Give us money, give us money, give us money for
Okay.
that. And more recently, I'm hearing, um, now it's not even those two things. Now it's just literally just give us money.
Yeah.
Under any, no pretense at all. It's just give us your money.
Yeah, well, I think that's what you're seeing with a lot of cultic organizations under financial pressure. The JWs are being very similar,
Mm.
right? That instead of money staying in the local congregations, it all gets rolled up lines now. Ownership of the buildings is now up lines. It's not at the local level.
Oh, I
And
guess they took a page from Scientology on that. How
well,
interesting.
I think it's of any organization that's under financial pressure. I
Mm.
think we'll see that with um, Southern Baptists, which are going to start getting suits for sexual abuse. I think any organization,
Fair
religious
enough.
or cultic organization is going to start to do that.
Cool.
So the thing is that let's say that COVID has cut their number by 100 million a year. They're still able to remain profitable. They there are some costs around the Sea Org labor, even though the direct salaries paid to the Sea Org are trivial, right? Feeding and housing and busing them securely from,
Yeah.
the motels to Flag, that's real cash out. It might be $600 or $1,000 a person a month. So you're looking at, 40, 30, 40, 50 million a year in staff costs.
Right. And let's be clear that those costs are the costs that are covered by the local ground level
Yeah,
organizations.
or Flag or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. But those are the costs that are borne by the local
right,
churches and organizations. It's not money coming down from Miscavige's level to subsidize them.
right. So the point being that I think they are able to run close enough to break even that they're not dipping into the reserves.
Yeah.
And my best number on the reserves is probably somewhere around 2 billion, and it could be a nudge higher,
Yeah.
but it's not 14 billion. Um,
Mhm.
and so I don't think they're dipping into the reserves. So um, they're probably less profitable, but I think they're still, um, economically viable without, wholesale dipping into the reserves to try to keep things going.
Okay.
So I think that you know COVID is a huge disruption, but I don't think it's financially devastating. And the switch is, the switch is still, the question is still open as to whether it is devastating in terms of membership. Um,
I will. Yeah. I think if I might contribute this much, I will say
sure.
that I think that if you look at the distribution of the money, I think you're looking at, the concentration of wealth, of course, is at Miscavige's level. It
Hmm.
really goes up, 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 right? And at the lower levels, I think we have seen some devastation in terms of why these buildings have been locked up for a while. They're not delivering the services they need to deliver to make, good money. And with the Chase Wave canceled just before COVID, that whole pipeline of basically free money that they were getting for about 5 year period dried up.
Hmm.
So I think if I were looking at it from maybe, I don't know, if I were going to diagram the concentric circles of Scientology, I'd say they're pretty dry on the edges, but they might still be flush and wet on the inside, if that is a
Yeah.
silly way of saying it.
So let's talk about the Chase Wave.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So the thing is, I read that, and all the coverage of that, and was absolutely stunned, because that is a massive case of fraud.
Yeah. Huge.
So let's first off, let's uh, let's think about what's the legal issue. And the legal issue is that this is a very complex case, and it may be too complex, for the government to go after.
Hmm.
So the very first thing I would say is, don't expect to see Miscavige perp walked out of Flag over this.
Hmm.
Um, I just think that there are too many cutouts, and there are too many other things that would have to happen in order for that to take place, and I just don't see that happening. As delightful as it is to envision that, I just don't think that's realistic. I think they may go after individual defendants. They may go after, sort of first level regs. Scientology may be seen as having a guilty conscience because they took all the regs and fired them, and they
Oh
tried to
yeah, they
bury
moved
this.
everybody around.
Right. So there's definitely, there is a chance um, that there's prosecution, because this is a coordinated fraud where the organization was really, um, pushing it. They were pushing people to encourage customers to sign up for these cards, and they were coordinating knowledge. So it is a racketeering sort of situation.
Mm.
But then you say, okay, Um, so how big might this have been?
Right.
And and so if you look at some of the numbers that were being bandied about of, that people are opening tens of thousands of dollars worth of cards,
Yeah.
then you say, okay, so if we take the number of maybe 15,000 active Scientologists, and maybe half of those in the U.S., and we say that maybe so that's 8,000 Scientologists in the U.S. And let's say they maybe did this a quarter to a third of the time. You have 2 to 3,000 people that were sucked up in this.
Hmm.
You have maybe 25, and if you say, okay, maybe $25,000 is the average take,
Hmm.
you basically are looking at 50 to 75 million over 5 years. So you're looking at $1 million a month.
Hmm.
Um, what you think about is that the government would have to put a lot of money into prosecuting that. When there's $75 million in play, um, they may not do anything other than just pick off easy meat where they can.
Right. Especially my lawyer friend tells me as well that because they acted or seemed to act with speed and ferocity to, reorganize and take all the people who are doing things off the line, Chase has canceled Scientology's ability to use Chase anymore. Or the Chase Bank,
Yeah.
you're done.
But
Um,
consider this though,
mhm,
that Chase is going to report this to the card company, the card issue or the card networks.
mhm.
So Visa and MasterCard. So their experience is not going to be unique. They're not going to be able to, Scientology is not going to be able to simply say, okay, cross out Chase and replace it with Wells Fargo. Not going to happen.
That's right. That's exactly right. Just like they had to, but this is history repeating itself because I know when I worked at the advanced organization of Los Angeles, the where they deliver the OT level stuff, we couldn't take Amex for a very similar backstory
Mhm.
reason.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
this
Although Amex is,
does catch up with them, but
yeah.
it won't result necessarily in, just to finish that thought, in criminal prosecution.
Mhm. But when you think about it, the card companies themselves are going to learn from this, and they're actually very very good at learning from sophisticated frauds.
Hmm.
So here's an example. It's an oldie but a goodie, and this shows you a little bit about what kind of pattern detection that they're good at.
Hmm.
So if you want to get your card turned off, here's how to do it. Take a card that you haven't used in a week or two and go buy gas. And then go and have lunch at Chili's or Applebee's or Burger King or something. But probably go have lunch at a regular restaurant. Then go to Best Buy and buy a flat screen TV. Guarantee you 100% that you will be on the phone with your credit card company because that charge at Best Buy for a TV will be denied because that absolutely looks like a fraudulent pattern. Somebody stole a card. The first thing they do is they go to an unattended terminal for a small transaction, right? You don't have to have somebody look at the card and say, gee, you're not Debbie Schneider. You're a 6 foot tall guy
Right.
and I don't think your name is Debbie. Let's see some ID. Right. So an unattended terminal, and just to find out if the card's been turned off or not. And then you try, a little bit bigger, $40 or $50 charge to see if there's some room on the card. And then you go for the big score.
Right.
And if you do that one after the other in that sequence, I guarantee you that you will get your card turned off, and you'll have to call them and identify yourself to get it turned back on.
Right.
Um, and so that's a very simple fraud example compared to what they're doing. So now the thing is, in the wake of the Chase wave, they know the names of a couple thousand Scientologists. And so anytime that those guys go to apply for credit, it's going to be flagged by not just Chase, but MasterCard and Visa. And
Well, and let's be clear, Chase has actually canceled the accounts of every Scientologist already.
oh, they have. Okay.
They have. If you ever had a charge on your Chase account to a vendor that was a Church of Scientology, you don't have a Chase card anymore.
Okay. Very interesting. So, and so you'll probably have a real tough time getting credit. And that's going to, I think, get some people really, the rank and file type members, not the whales, but that'll get the rank and file members thinking about, these guys really have screwed me for life. It's not just the money that they racked up on my cards that I can't get back, but now they have, I'm not going to be able to get a mortgage. I'm not going to be able to do that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the other thing that they can do now is that now that they also have those identities, if people have other cards from other issuers and they start pumping huge amounts of money onto it, they'll be able to detect whether Scientology is using cutouts or other means to get around the fact that Scientology's merchant accounts have been terminated.
Mm.
And so if Scientology tries anything like this again, they are going to be detected fairly quickly because there's a huge knowledge base, there's a huge database of people that participated in this that aren't necessarily going to be charged criminally, but those people are marked for life, and their charges are going to be watched for life.
Exactly. Yeah, the world we live in now, when it comes to financial controls, is a much more tightly regulated and controlled world than the one Hubbard came up in.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and you think about the level of surveillance. Fraudsters think they're pretty smart guys, but there are a lot of very, very expensive programmers at MasterCard and Visa that are looking at sophisticated network frauds because they've already solved all the easy frauds, like the one I was talking about with buy gas, buy lunch, buy a TV. They've already figured those out.
Well, this might be an opportune moment to actually detail a couple of the specifics that we have here of what they were doing when we're sitting here calling it the Chase Wave, and it was a series of different things that were done. And I want to go over them real fast because I've interviewed people, we've talked about this, but I haven't really broken it down this way. So let me just do this really fast.
Sure.
Because there's really only a couple bullet points here, but it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting how they came up with different avenues or vectors of approach to get more money out of these credit card companies. And the Chase Wave, you had multiple cards applied for on the same day before the bank's records were updated. This made it so that a person who qualified for a $10,000 limit would get 3 cards with a $10,000 limit, then merge them and have a $30,000 limit. See? You'd make up income figures in the credit card applications to increase the credit limits. They were signing up for cards for people either while they were there or on the phone or without them knowing. Just straight up applying for cards in people's names. That's absolutely fraudulent.
Mm-hmm.
Credit refresh. And it's a little complicated, but the way it was explained to me here is Joe has $30K in debt and a 600 credit score. Bill has just gotten a Chase Wave card for $30,000 and it's empty. So Joe does a balance transfer of his entire debt to Bill's new Chase card. Next month, when the credit scores are calculated, Joe has paid off all his debts, has free credit, so his credit score massively jumps. He uses his new credit score to apply for more cards, maybe even Chase Wave cards, and gets $40,000 in new credit. Bill balance transfers the $30,000 back to Joe's new card. Now Joe has $40K in new credit. So it's this back and forth swiping to game the system with your credit rating. So all of these and combinations of these things. And then not only were those balance transfers being done, but there were other actions being done all under this term of bridging loans, where one Scientologist would loan another guy money based on the idea that the credit was coming in. And sometimes it didn't. And then, the guy was left hanging, and that creates ill repute and bad blood and all of that as well.
Yeah. So you're pissing off your whales or your sort of somewhat junior whales by having them, loan money to somebody who didn't get the credit from the Chase Wave.
Exactly.
Good move.
Exactly. But in the excitement of all of this, and all of this was originated, all of this was figured out and exported around the world from Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So,
yeah.
So, here's, a couple of reactions to all of that. First off, in particular, things like understanding that you can open multiple accounts on the same day and the system doesn't process that or doesn't, register that in real time, but that it registers it nightly.
Mhm.
That's very, very detailed knowledge of Chase's internal systems and procedures.
Mhm.
So this is not the sort of thing that some, Sea Org Reg figured out by themselves. Sounds like something that somebody was very plugged into, how these kinds of crime networks operate, these fraud networks operate, that they're using a playbook that was developed and already successful by somebody else.
Interesting.
And
Very possible, very possible. And I will say though that you know, it's hard to underestimate the craftiness of a Sea Org member who is under the gun to get his stats up by Thursday too.
yeah, but it would take a lot of experimentation to figure that out, and to figure that out that it's an attribute of Chase and not somebody else.
Absolutely.
I'm very surprised to hear that, because most systems these days do real time updates, and if you apply for a card, it's in there, and you're not going to be able to apply twice for an offer or something. So
Right.
that's but I just think the Chase Wave, they were plugging into, somebody taught them, somebody who was a knowledgeable scammer taught them how to do that.
Fair enough. It's entirely possible.
But it'll be interesting to see if this does actually turn out to be jail time for anybody in the organization.
Yeah. Cool.
So
Those are the specifics
well,
of what they were doing there. And
well,
where were
let's take
we?
a look at, let me just take a one other point that comes just to mind,
Yeah.
which is all of this Chase Wave is not about, I don't think it's about IAS donations. It's about getting money on account for services.
It was all about service sales, because the Scientologists, the public Scientologists, were told by Sea Org members who they believe as authority figures that this was all legit.
Mhm.
They were pumped. There was so much excitement being generated over this that people were flying into Los Angeles to, take part in this amazing thing and get their auditing and finally go clear and get to OT and all of that. There was a lot of enthusiasm in the Scientology world over this whole.
Interesting. Until the House of Cards finally started to come down, right?
That's right, in 2019. That's right.
So what's interesting is that this is, that they had to know, either the people that introduced this, they had to know this was criminal fraud. You can't, in the back of your head, if you've been in the world, this is wrong, and you may not know exactly how much jail time it's going to earn you, but you have to know you're risking jail to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, were sales of services so bad that somebody said it's worth taking the risk, for me individually and for the organization and for a bunch of my friends, in order to keep our stats up?
And the answer to that I would say would be a resounding yes.
And
And again, this is history repeating itself with Scientology. You can go back in time and find purposefully bad checks being written, that didn't have the money covering them yet, and they were cashed. We saw that in the 70s. We saw credit unions being put together in the late 70s. All kinds of crazy stuff going on within the world of Scientology, to make that money.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
the thing that happened was just in terms of the precursor to this all started when the Sea Org took over Los Angeles Org.
Mm.
The LA Org, right? They sent a bunch of Sea Org guys in there, and it was just Sea Org staff now. And it was get to work, get making money, Golden Age of Tech 2. This thing has to be a success, and it's on you guys to make it a success. And if you're not making money, you better figure it out. You better figure it out. That's the kind of direction you get from management in Scientology. You better figure it out. So
make it go right.
That's right. Make it go right. If they, that's the ultimate supreme test. Is Thetan's ability to make it go right. So they were making it go right, and everybody was enthusiastically excited about how much it was going right for a few years, until this all, like we said, caught up with them.
And so it blows up in 2019, and then COVID happens in 2020. That's a major
right.
1-2 punch.
That's right.
So So I think the takeaway is I think we can root for people to go to jail for this, but I don't think we want to count on. I don't think we want to treat that as a given.
No.
It could very well happen, but at the very least, I think we can be fairly confident that this sort of credit card fraud on this scale has been pretty much choked off.
Yep. That's right. Yeah.
Um,
And internally, moves made so that it never happens again. Now,
Yeah.
how long that's going to hold out for until a fresh wave of criminally minded people come along, who's to say? But for now, that practice has absolutely been killed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned that Amex was a target a while ago,
Mhm.
and the thing is, Amex operates their own proprietary network, and so they're likely behind, and especially if you go back in time, they're likely behind Mastercard and Visa on fraud. Mastercard and Visa between them run 1 billion charge transactions a day. They have a lot of data to sort through that they can sort through looking for patterns, and they have the horsepower and the brain power to figure out ways to do that. Amex didn't. So if you have now been desperate enough that you've moved up from the relatively farm team Amex network to try to commit fraud on Mastercard and Visa, and you've gotten shut down, you got really nowhere else to go.
Good point. Good point. And that could spell some real trouble for them coming in the next few years, because credit's always been the magic carpet ride for Scientology. Hubbard's policies talk about how you shouldn't use credit, but that's never been the practice in the real world with Scientology. People go up the bridge on credit.
Yep.
So if they can't get it, they can't go up the bridge, because the prices are the prices, and they're not going to come significantly down.
Yeah, and guess what? The cost of credit's going up, whether it's credit cards or home equity loans, right? With the Fed interest rate, interest rates going up, right? The mortgage market is cooling pretty rapidly right now in terms of the number of transactions going on because of the rates, and we are not likely to see 3% fixed 30-year fixed mortgages again in our lifetimes. I don't think.
Wow. So we're seeing. So we can. So would it be accurate that we could predict fairly reliably that there's some lean times ahead for Scientology, at least at that level?
I think in terms of getting people to take out loans for more services, yes.
Yeah.
I think that we can predict reasonably what's likely already happening, which is a shift back to donation and status-based sorts of things. Especially as events can crank up again. But even without that, just much more in the way of milking the whales. And I think that this sort of is a good segue into one thing to think about is the whole idea of how does Scientology survive? And the answer is that they changed the mission, right? We tend to have this bias of thinking about Scientology as a rational business, and businesses you have to grow. If you simply lay stagnant where the revenue is the same every year in dollars, well, as inflation goes off, you're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and less relevant and less effective. So businesses need to grow, and they typically need to grow both sales and profits. But Scientology doesn't have to do that. They have the reserves, and they don't have to grow. But so we tend to look at Scientology and say, well, membership is shrinking. They've been through this, COVID, so revenue, sales are shrinking. And like any, at some point in a business, revenue shrinks long enough, you have to finally just say, I'm done. But Scientology doesn't have to do that. Right. And so if Miscavige redefines the focus and the mission of Scientology away from expanding, all of the talk about expansion in a broad sense, and that it's really, that he's really focused on protecting a couple of things that are not growth and expansion, then he can last for a very long time indeed. And I think those two things are the whales and the status-based system. So he has to maintain just enough of a front of orgs that are viable, but eventually they're going to be down to 1 or 2 people in an org. They're not really going to be able to do any services, and they're going to go to an appointment system so that if you're a whale, you want to come into Cincinnati and do something, you have to have an appointment, and then they fly in a bunch of people to make it look busy. And I hope you
Right.
don't notice that the same people in Cincinnati that audited you are the same people that when you go to Clearwater are auditing you, and that they always seem to be at whatever org you visit.
That's
Right.
right.
So,
Or they
and
might drop the pretense of that outer org entirely because, as they've been pulling in their flippers, they have to decide where are we going to send Sea Org people to man this up and where are we going to start closing doors? Because with COVID, the precedent was already set that they literally closed orgs.
yeah,
And that was, I just cannot stress enough how unthinkable that was 10 years ago when I was in.
that is indeed, a red line that's been crossed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's one where it's going to be a while before they can craft a message that's going to be tolerable to people.
Yep.
That says, hey, remember the $40 million that you worked so hard to raise to rehab the Cincinnati org or the, Kansas City org or whatever? Well, we just closed it and we're keeping all the money.
Yeah.
And now you got to come to flag and tough.
That's right, and that's basically what it'll come down to. But they'll stick some spin on it that will convince a few people at least.
Well, hard to say. Let's take
Yeah.
a conservative view and let's say that they're going to keep the orgs going long, long past their sell-by date before they have to confront that, because it's the whales that gave to the orgs. But I think if you say, okay, well, what's the number that they most have to predict most have to protect? I think it's the staff count. If you look at what Miscavige gets out of the organization, he's not running Scientology as a babe farm. It is not. It is not about having large numbers of nubile, young, willing females that for him to have sex with.
Right.
He hides from the world, and like Hubbard, who was terrified of sex, while there was plenty of sexual misbehavior in Scientology, it wasn't Hubbard out nailing the messengers.
Correct. That's right. And Miscavige is I mean, just from every single report we've got, and then literally every one, he's just not a sexual predator. He's a violent predator.
Yes. And what is it that feeds him? It's abuse of the staff. Mm-hmm. It's having a giant organization of people that are all terrified of him.
Yep.
And it's what's called financial domination of the members. It's that pain and suffering when he's gotten them to pay more money they can afford, and that they have harmed themselves significantly by, whatever they've done with the Chase Wave, right? That that people live with that harm and that memory, and that he can still keep them coming back.
That's right.
And so it's the financial cruelty to the membership, and it's the terrorizing of the staff, and having the staff, by being out of the way and mysterious, and when he pops in, everybody just like loses their shit, when he shows up at random. So that's what he's in it for. And in order for that to work, he's got to have staff. And that's more important than having new members coming in and having growth figures and so forth. And he's got to have a small number of people that he can dominate and manipulate financially. And that's really the whales. That's right. I think, the thing that I still think is one of the most interesting and most significant pieces of writing about the future of Scientology is a post by Jeff Augustine, writing under the name of Jay Swift. And it was on ESMB in 2008, right around the time of the Anons. And he called it Monastery Scientology. And Monastery Scientology was a prediction that, Miscavige was going to give up on trying to bring in, generic new rank and file members. He was going to cater only to the whales. He was going to retreat to Los Angeles, St. Hill, and Clearwater. And while some of the specific predictions aren't in fact happening, the general idea of Scientology retreating from the world and being a religion that waits hand and foot on a small number of whales, that's very much alive. And I think it's still viable today, and it's something that everybody should really read. So
Absolutely. I'll post a link to it.
Yeah, great.
In the show notes. Yeah, because I've got that here. And And it is. It was actually very prescient in some ways, considering when it was written. He really did do a good job on this article, so I do recommend you all check it out. Um, I'm gonna, and I'll throw out one other thing there, just since I'm thinking about it right now, I've really not talked too much about it because it's purely conjectural on my part. But given the opportunities here, it's not inconceivable that whales could be, blackmailed or could be coerced into giving more and more money at that level because of the secrets they divulge or the information that is made available to Scientology
Yeah,
by them.
yeah.
That's not unthinkable.
No, I think that the pressure on them is going to go up, but
Hmm.
I think the offset to that pressure is going to be the personal service that they would get when they move back to the Clearwater area. And we've clearly seen Tom Cruise selling off a number of his properties. I think he's the ranch in Telluride, Colorado, has been on sale for a while. I think he's out of New York. I think his place in Beverly Hills, I don't know if that's sold, but he's been pretty much jettisoning his entire real estate portfolio, stuff that he's owned for a long time.
Hmm.
You've got Travolta, who is just like 90 miles up the road in Ocala with his private airport, has now got a place in Clearwater. You've got Kirstie Alley, who's been in LA and in Maine, now in Clearwater. So a lot of these people, and I think in the last couple of weeks, Michael Pena's also made the move.
Oh,
So you've
that's
got
very interesting.
so you've got a lot of folks that either now have second homes in Clearwater uh, or now making primary residence in Clearwater, and
That's interesting.
so I think there's a real there's a real trend there. And you
Yeah.
say, okay, so what is worth the potential to get ripped raw by Regis showing up on your doorstep on any given night because you now live in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And I think it's that waiting on hand and foot and being told that you're a special person. And so if you look at here's a fun number. One of the things that cruise ships do is they manage their number of crew members per guest very carefully. And so a luxury cruise line might have as much as one crew member for every um, like two guests. And the more budget ones are going to have like one crew member for every like five guests. Um, and so a luxury cruise line is somebody who's spending, and you've got you've got crew members that don't touch the guests. You've got engineers,
Of course.
bridge people, cooks and so forth. They don't directly interact with the guests, but you in Clearwater, let's say you have 500 whales and you've got about 2,000 staff keeping that operation going. You've got a lot of labor that can provide waiting on hands and foot to whales, not just when they're in the, um, not just when they're in the flag building, but when they're at home too. That and you're essentially having people like has been rumored, and Tony Ortega and others have published that Tom Cruise's entourage is filled with people who report back to Miscavige.
That's right.
But
Why
so I
would
think
that not apply to the other whales?
exactly, and so
Yeah.
now you have Scientology, the helpful Sea Org guy that runs your laundry to the dry cleaners. And if all of a sudden you stop your laundry at the dry cleaners and you don't let the Sea Org guy in anymore, that's going to be noted,
Right.
and it's going to be seen as a potential risk of disaffection or
Mm.
whatever it is. And so they've got the labor pool out there to really keep an eye on that small number of whales that they need in order to keep the monastery Scientology going for a long time and to keep delivering the emotional benefits that Miscavige at the top wants.
That's right. That's right. Because the secret sauce here. Let's remember, by the way, always keep in mind that the secret sauce with Scientology is the auditing.
Mhm.
That's the euphoria creating, inducing process. And it's a repetitive process. You just keep going back for more. It's an addictive process. And there is nothing special about Kirstie Alley or Michael Pena or Tom Cruise for that matter that somehow makes them immune from that addictive process.
Mhm.
And that's what keeps people coming back for more. So I mentioned blackmail earlier or influence peddling earlier as a potential here But let's always remember that they don't really have to go there that often when they can just get you addicted to these dopamine hits, right? These
Yep.
serotonin hits. So
And you've got
that's
to,
at the core. If people are like, well, how come? Why do they keep coming back? That's why.
Mhm.
It's powerful stuff.
Yeah. And so I think if you have people that can interact with you and serve you in a
Hmm.
way that, you know, if I have a Sea Org person, it's a lot cheaper than having my own domestic help.
Big time.
And so if I have them reinforcing the the nice feelings about Scientology, just like the nice feelings they get from auditing, I'm going to be loyal. And so they're going to gently insinuate those resources when they are not busy taking care of public into taking care of the whales.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's it's not an unwarranted idea.
So
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of a potential future. So let's look at some other things that could happen
Hmm.
that could affect the future significantly, either endogenous or exogenous shocks, or some things that are, I think, a combination of both.
Hmm.
So the first off is what happens when Miscavige dies?
Lots of things could happen.
Okay,
Yeah. I've always sort of bounced the ball back on that question because my answer is completely depends on the context of how he disappears.
okay, but let's presume.
Hmm.
I think for the sake of a cautious assumption,
Hmm.
let's presume that he doesn't leave his office in handcuffs, that he leaves his office in a box.
Yep. I think that's a more likely outcome, by the way.
Yeah, and or that he strokes out and is, in a persistent vegetative state. But anyway, something that's medically or just dying of old age related,
Yep.
that he leaves in a box. Um, I think there's going to be a war of succession, and I think it's going to be, that he got rid of all of the potential rivals, in terms of his direct reports. So it's going to be somebody that nobody has heard of that somehow manages to seize the reins.
Hmm.
And I don't know that there's going to be factions that will form and campaign, such as, we know that, we think there's a pretty good likelihood that Putin in Russia has cancer and he's only got a couple years to live. And so there's a lot of factions among the state security people, or the 100 or so most powerful people in Russia. There are factions forming to try to, get their guy to either be the guy in the big chair or to get their guy in the big chair.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but I don't think that Scientology is going to have that kind of uh, situation, just because the individual factions are so weak.
Hmm.
Um, I think it may be the case that Miscavige takes the passwords for the offshore bank accounts to his grave. So there could be a lot of financial constraints that don't happen.
That's the
Um,
thing I have been suspecting would be the case.
but they can still manage to. I still think that, yes, they may have some financial pressure, that they don't have the reserves available to to get to get them through a rainy day, but they can still cut costs.
Yep.
And at that point, you may start to see something like shutting down the orgs that aren't profitable,
Right.
and more explicitly driving people to come to flag, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Um, and just remember, Hubbard died and the organization continued to grow
Mhm.
for a number of years.
Mhm.
So, Hubbard did not take any precautions for succession. Miscavige won't. So, but I just don't think that Miscavige's death is automatically doomed for the organization. I think it's gonna be a challenge. It's going to be chaos. But I think the organization, because of the size of the bureaucracy, um, and the fact that a lot of policy is still set in stone, even though a lot of it's ignored, I think it's still going to be. I think it's still going to be around.
Absolutely. I know of two people right now who could potentially step up. Not public names, not names that anybody's going to recognize. So I'm not even going to say them. But high level Sea Org members right now who are and have been carrying the burden of carrying the organization for quite some time at Miscavige's directions. And so there are definitely people there who are doing all kinds of work to keep the thing going who could theoretically move up that ladder. And and as far as him dying and taking the bank account, with him, I mean, yes, but probably not really. I mean, there are tax attorneys and a
Yeah.
thing in place to when we talk about Sea Org reserves, this is documented somewhere. It's just not
Yeah.
documented publicly. So, so potentially this could be picked up and it could be reorganized in very interesting ways depending on who takes over.
Mhm.
All kinds of things could happen with this.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, quite honestly, one of the things I'm a little afraid of, to be honest, is that a kinder, gentler person takes over and creates and sparks a renaissance.
Yeah, it could happen.
I mean,
And it could happen.
yeah,
And I want to give an example in a minute of an organization where that did actually happen, a cultic organization, and they did have a bit of a renaissance.
mm,
But I think this is sort of under the larger thing of, let's think about Danny Masterson and the potential impact there.
sure,
And you have a looming PR disaster going on,
huge.
but
Yeah.
but you have there's a it's hard to get people to care about certain types of sexual abuse. It's almost a given that a cult is going to have a babe, is going to be a babe farm for the leaders.
Mhm.
And, we're surprised that Scientology isn't.
That's right.
But, like meditation, yoga, there's any number of Buddhist monks, all of these guys have been revealed as, having a babe farm.
Yep.
Among the followers. And, it's kind of expected. And so the ability of certain types of sexual abuse, no matter how large scale or abhorrent, isn't a guarantee that it's going to bring the organization down. So it's possible that direct enabling of Masterson's evasion of justice by Scientology, in terms of proof in court, it is possible that that's going to get a huge amount of press. It's possible that it won't, because this has been dribbling out for a while. There was early coverage of his arrest. It may be hard to bring that back to light. So it isn't clear that that the Masterson thing is going to put people on alert about Scientology. And even if it does, it's going to choke off recruiting of new members that's already not happening. All right. So I think that, Miscavige, we're not going to see Miscavige cuffed on this. We're not going to see, I think the odds are reasonable that Masterson gets convicted.
Oh yeah, I think they're more than reasonable that he's going to jail.
Yeah.
The chances of Sea Org members coming in and testifying is slim to none, I think. And the idea that any of them are going to get wrangled into this, or that cover-up is going to get wrangled into this, I think is very, very marginal.
Yeah, no, I think the cognoscenti of Scientology criticism and the people who are into news hounds and so forth that read all of this stuff are going to be horrified by it. But I just don't think it's going to have the legs to really affect the population.
Yeah.
Now that said, I think so. We're talking about the idea that there are a lot of scandals, sexual scandals, that kind of don't affect cults. But there are some that have. And to come back to the group that actually has had a bit of a renaissance, I'd look at the Hare Krishnas. Now, if we go back 50 years, those of us who are around remember Hare Krishnas in airports wearing weird haircuts with saffron robes and trying to sell us flowers and chanting and banging on drums and all sorts of other weirdness.
Yes.
And so they got to a certain level, and I've read a little bit about this, but not done a huge dive on it. But they got to a certain level of membership. I don't know if it's 50,000, 30,000, 100,000, whatever in the U.S. And they started setting up schools. And the thing was that the schools had a widespread incidence of systematic sexual abuse of the kids in their care. And it was horrific, and it was really endemic. It was just to the point where the leadership said, this is an existential threat. If we don't stop this proactively ourselves, they are we are going to get wiped out of the face of the earth.
Hmm.
And there were some prosecutions, there were some notice and so forth, but they realized that if they didn't do something about this, it was going to blow up massively. And so they went through a complete shift in evolution, to a degree that I couldn't even begin to articulate. But what they believed, how they operated, they closed down the schools, they got rid of the bad people, and now these days, all of the old Hare Krishnas with the chanting and the weird clothes and the weird haircuts, those are all gone. And Hare Krishna is basically just sort of an odd Hindu sect, like a number of other odd Hindu sects, and the population is a lot more brown than white.
Hmm.
And so they're not thriving, but they're not teetering on the precipice of going out of business. And so, that is that idea of systematic sexual abuse that's pervasive is something that can significantly damage an organization. And I think there's, when children are involved, sexual abuse, becomes that much more heightened. I think we have an instinct to protect children, which is why the QAnon thing has been so successful, is that they have this fantasy that there's this cabal of child abusers,
That's right.
satanic pedophiles, right? This is like,
Oh, it gives them, it empowers them as they think they're superheroes that fighting back against this. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, there you go with that thing of trying to give a meaningless and ordinary life some meaning. I'm not just a, schmo with a crappy job, working part-time in a tire store. I'm fighting satanic pedophiles that control the world.
That's right. As epitomized by the guy who went to Comet Ping Pong and with the gun. I'm here to save the kids. I'm here to get in there, and I mean that's really what they think they're doing.
Yep. And so you've got this sort of horror of systematic child abuse. And so one thinks that maybe before I say that, let's look at child abuse in established wide mainstream religions, right? The biggest example is the Catholic Church.
Huge.
And you've got, while there are several thousand documented cases that the church is admitted to, if you play the math, it's substantially higher. It's hundreds of thousands of kids were abused. And, to their credit, the church has worked diligently to reform, although there are plenty of elements within the church that are, dragging their feet or outright opposing it. I'm not a Catholic. I never have been. I'm not anti-Catholic. So, I'm horrified at the scope of the problem, but they seem to also be the lead to whatever level of effectiveness in trying to deal with it and confront it. And you're dealing with, they paid out many billions of dollars in settlements, and they're closing churches as a result. If you look at in the Northeast and the Midwest, they're closing buildings.
Are they?
Yes, they are.
That's news to me.
Yeah, there is some growth that's happening in places in the Sun Belt, Arizona, Texas, places like that. Principally non-native born populations, immigrant populations. So there is some growth, but they are, they are closing in the Northeast, Chicago and other places as well. So it is hurting them, and weekly church attendance is dropping. The abuse scandals. Ireland was the most Catholic country in the world. In the 70s, 90+% of the population went to church every week. Now that number is about 30% in 40, 50 years.
That again, news to me. That is, I knew they were hit, but I didn't realize that to me, Ireland has always been a Catholic stronghold. So
and it has been. But they're not exporting priests. They don't have enough internally generated priests to service the congregations that still exist. And a lot of that has been due to the sexual abuse scandals and the workhouse scandals. So there's a lot of there's a lot of disgust among the population that these people were out of touch. Now we're seeing the same thing with Canada, with all the indigenous schools that were often run by nuns and so forth, and these unmarked graves, and just utterly horrific. And I'm sure that's going to affect the image of Catholicism there.
Exactly. Well, the thing with the difference between master, I would say that in looking back at pulling back the Masterson's case, here you're looking at what will be argued and could be argued legitimately as,
Yep.
well, this is a Scientologist who went off the rails. This isn't a dogmatic thing.
Yep.
This wasn't even a Scientology minister, right?
Right.
This is just a Scientology celebrity who is rapey. And
Yep.
so, yeah, we're going to prosecute him. The idea that the church is going to get dragged into it and be shown to, exposed for all the cover up that they did, pretty unlikely.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, even if it's known, it's not systematic and universal the way it is with
That's
the
the
Catholic
point.
Church.
That's right.
And I do want to,
NXIVM,
yeah.
where it was the leader and his immediate inner circle,
And it was
actually branding women. I mean, that was
that was the thing that was too far,
yeah,
right? The branding was too far. Having a secret babe farm, not too far.
exactly. That's right.
And so that was a specific act that was over the top.
Yep.
So I think that's one axis. The other axis is, universal, broad pattern of child sexual abuse that's facilitated and condoned by the organization.
Right.
And so we've been talking about the Catholic Church, but I have said for a long time that when this starts to really hit the Protestants, it's going to hit them just as hard, if not harder.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we've just seen the Southern Baptists releasing their report and seeing a lot of denial around the severity and the impact of that.
Yep.
And I think there are plenty of other denominations as well. The only difference is that because the Catholic Church is much more centralized, it's a lot easier to sue. But I think that we now see complicity of the Southern Baptist national leadership in reassigning ministers, and we see their complicity, that they've had lists of people they know are suspect maintained nationally with a national reporting system. So that makes the national organization complicit. So I think there's, as the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., they have now got a target painted on their back. So, as I say, this is not a Catholic problem. This is a religion problem. And if you don't believe that it's just Christians, look at the abuse in Orthodox Jewish communities in New York and plenty of other places as well. It's pervasive in religion. And so,
yeah. And there's a lot of reasons for it, guys, including, misplaced power dynamics and authority figures and sexual repression and indoctrination. There's so many things going on there.
Yep.
I wanted to quickly, I know some people might be commenting furiously right now or thinking to themselves about this, like, but there is rampant sexual abuse in Scientology.
Right.
We're not denying that.
Right. Exactly.
There's no attempt here to whitewash Scientology as a non-abusive group when it comes to sexual abuse.
Right.
It's rampant, but go ahead.
And what I'm suggesting is that if it were shown that Scientology were engaging in this broad-based, organizationally sanctioned pattern of sexual abuse of children as endemic across the organization, then I think that is something that could be turned into an existential level of crisis that they could pop up. And so, I think, we had the Mace Kingsley Ranch, we've had, individual things in the past. I think the place to go is child labor, and also places like the Canyon Oaks Ranch, which is in northern LA County, in a very rural area, where they warehouse kids of staff or Sea Org or somebody or other.
Well, we have to be clear now that they actually shut that down too.
They did. Okay, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, that was a Sea Org school, boarding school type setup up in the hills outside LA. I knew lots of kids who came from there, and then they shut it down because of that potential legal and PR exposure. They got on top of that real quick.
So basically, they're if they are responding, they may be able to mute this before it blows up.
That's right. And I think that was their effort back then, because that was when kids who had been Sea Org members, raised in the Sea Org, got out and started telling their stories publicly. And this was in the 90s that this started.
Yeah, no, I did some looking into it probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it was still going. So I was looking for
Yeah.
property tax
Oh,
discrepancies and issues.
okay. As far as I understand it, they shut that down. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong. But as far as I know, they shut that property down.
Yeah, I had not tracked it, so I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I said, anybody out there has any knowledge or information about that you want to share, I am more than happy to review it.
But here's another example of where you get a situation that's kind of normal and nobody would regard it as a problem, and then you add one little twist, and it all of a sudden brings down a religious organization. And so that's Liberty University and Jerry Falwell Jr., the son of the founder.
Yeah.
So Falwell Jr. had a reputation for being a little bit out of control. And he was, running this organization, which is, 40,000 students. Many of them are, online, but, it's $1 billion+ organization. He'd been running it as his personal fiefdom. And he had been, it later came out that there had been some very questionable judgment on his part in the presence of women. But what brought him down and caused him to lose his job was that he was allowing his wife to sleep with a much younger man who he then showered with, corporate money. But the thing that really put it over the edge was that he was watching while his wife was getting nailed by this guy. He was and that was what brought him down, because that sort of masculinity, the sort of toxic masculine stereotype is like that he enjoys being cuckolded. That's what it was he was getting off on. That was too much.
Wow.
Corruption and financial shenanigans, you can be forgiven. Your wife is fooling around, that can be forgiven. That you were okay with it, that she was being, fooling around because you were trying to save your marriage, you can talk your way out of that. But watching, no, that's just right over the red line, and he's now completely out, disgraced, and hopefully we'll never see him again.
Wow. Doesn't circling back around to how we started this or kind of got onto this in the first place, isn't it interesting how you would never, ever in a million years, of all the people who've been watching Jerry Falwell Jr. all these years and hoping secretly and not so secretly for his downfall, who would have predicted that's what would have done it?
Yeah, that's I think you get to a point where you think you can operate with impunity, or you just have these urges that people enable you to get away with stuff, and you just like follow these weird things.
That's right.
And you do stupid stuff that is stupid, but as you're doing it, but you just like keep following it. I mean,
it's not, people talk about this in terms of, well, they're so full of their own power and ego and stuff, they think they can do no wrong. It's not only that, it's that there is a long series, right, of before that thing that they're getting busted for. There's a long series of bad judgments and decisions and bad things they did that they got away with.
Exactly right.
And that's what empowers them to keep pushing the envelope.
Exactly right. Yeah. And it's like, it might have been, well, he had an affair, then his wife found out about it, and then she said, I'm going to go have an affair. And then they worked out a deal where, okay, but only if I can vet the guy that you sleep with,
Right.
And then it turns into this, and then boom.
That's right.
But, it's like you don't know until after this happens whether the particular torque on the thing, right? So the NXIVM Babe Farm, that was business as usual until they started, cauterizing people.
That's right.
without their consent. This was okay until he, discovered in that masculinity type culture of he liked being cuckolded, and you can't. It's hard to predict that.
How could you possibly predict that? And that's why these predictions end up, I think you'd agree, we have to end up kind of generalizing them. Because how do you go that specific? You'd have to be a psychic to know that, like how would you possibly?
Yep. So this actually is something to end on, is to say, okay, so what is the what does Scientology's future look like? And the answer is it starts to look like, and so since it's not realistic to think about extinguishing Scientology so that it's completely out of business, all the orgs close, etc. What does it look like? Well, I think you have to say it's like a black hole. It's like the lifespan of a star that turns into a black hole. And so as it implodes, as it runs out of energy, the first thing is, the star's influence on other stars and other planets. In other words, let's try and minimize the harm that Scientology does to the world outside and to members, right? So, the rank and file members, if we can help them to get disillusioned and leave via messaging or, like that, then that's a good thing. If we can help so that people don't get recruited and new members get recruited, that's a good thing. And especially if we can help people from lesser developed countries, poorer countries or Ukraine now that there's millions of refugees sloshing around the world from Ukraine, help them become staff. That's the greatest good, right? So helping so that the people that are not in the Scientology orbit are not harmed by that.
Right.
That's the first stage of the sort of the implosion to a point, and eventually the organization gets to a point where it gets rid of all of the marginal members, and that's probably somewhat close to happening. But there's still a few. There's still a fair number.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. But it has been, and I was reminded of this today. I was posting a critical clip on my Clips channel from 4 years ago where I talked about how they were circling the wagons way back then.
Yep.
By harshly treating their on the fence members. Oh, you're on the fence? Well, you better get in here and get your ethics interview, or we're going to investigate you and ComEv you and and contact all your family and friends and start talking crap to them about you. So they were already, tightening the grip, iron glove, the iron fist coming down harder. So all these things you've just been talking about is exactly what's been happening.
Yeah, and it will continue. Ultimately, as it implodes, it will cast off, the least committed members.
Yep.
And we're now at a point where the least committed members are still way more committed than people who left 20 years ago.
Yep.
But they're the least committed members, and they're going to be out. They're going to be out.
Right.
So at some point, the organization will reach a relatively equilibrium state, just like a black hole, where nothing gets out, but not much else gets in, because it's already, everything in the neighborhood has already been sucked into the black hole, and now everything else is far enough away that it's outside the gravitational well.
That's right.
And Scientology can indeed continue for a very long time, but its ability to harm people reaches a minimum. It isn't going to reach zero for a long time, but it will reach a minimum. And at that point, you have to say, unfortunately, you have to say good enough is good enough. As far as trying to shut it down, unless some completely bizarre thing happens that we can't even possibly begin to predict.
That's right. Like some, I don't know. It'd have to be crazy. I mean, it'd have to be church sanctioned mass shooting or something. I mean, it'd have to be something
exactly
really whack,
Exactly.
Yeah. It'd have to be something crazy. But those, of course, are the things that are by their nature unpredictable.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So I could not agree with you more. I think we have covered some incredibly important stuff here in this, in terms of what to look at and look for, and the things that inform us. And these, what are longtime Scientology watchers? What should you be looking at and looking for and doing about all of this? Right? Is exposure is the thing that gets people's attention and keeps people away. And that's pretty much been the focus of my channel for the last 9-10 years, right? Has been, how can I get information out there to discourage people from signing up or checking it out or looking into it? Because here's what it really is. Oh, okay, good. Now I know to stay away from it. And that's been pretty successful, And now we're seeing just bad decision after bad decision. And who knows, they could pull out of this nosedive that they're in right now, or Miscavige or somebody else could have some random or not so random great idea and do a 180 and turn it around.
Yeah, unlikely, but possible.
Very unlikely, but we have to put it there.
Yep. But I think, ultimately you say, okay, so what do those of us who have invested a lot of effort thinking about or working to, protect the world from the harms of Scientology? What happens to us after that?
Mhm.
And I think the answer is pretty obvious. What we've learned here will help us deal with a lot of similar spontaneously arising organizations. I think that social media has a consequence of allowing cults to to arise spontaneously more than ever before. And the skills that we've learned in organizing, publicizing, thinking about, strategizing, demonstrating, all of that really will stand us in helping the world more broadly in a very, very crazy age. So we've got the self-proclaimed Queen of Canada. We've got this woman who's clearly mentally ill, who has got thousands of people threatening businesses for their COVID policies, and now doing all sorts of other bizarre things and potentially becoming violent. That's just one of many examples of craziness that we have.
That's right.
And so the world needs, at some point we'll move on from Scientology, but the world needs people who will stand up and campaign for truth and science and intellectual honesty.
Exactly. Exactly. I hope that what we're doing here is encouraging that kind of behavior, that kind of thinking, that kind of looking, and that kind of action. It's not just, these things are not fought just through a keyboard. These are people. You got to go talk to, you got to interact, you got to get out in the world and do something about these things, and that's really the whole effort here. So John, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. And it was really good to kind of get back into the game and talk about some of this stuff. And I'm looking forward to our next one, which we won't spoil by announcing the topic.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Thank you again, folks out there. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching and listening and supporting. And I hope that you found this show informative, educational, and entertaining. Maybe a little bit. And I hope you will subscribe to the channel, share this work out and about there on the interwebs. And of course, if you like what we're doing here, show us some love on the channel through some financial support. That all being said, see you guys next week. Bye-bye.